Okay, excellent. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, I'm Carrie Jorgensen. I've read thousands of college applications, supported over 1,000 families as a college counselor, and watched too many kids arrive at senior year completely overwhelmed, not because they weren't prepared, but because no one gave them a roadmap. And that's why I built Early Bird, and that's why we're here today. This is session 1 of 5 webinars, and I promise every single one will be worth your time. Over the last 17 years, I've worked as a high school counselor supporting families inside the admissions offices at UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz, evaluating over 2,000 applications, and in the private sector, advising families who could afford elite counseling. I've seen this from every single angle. And here's what surprised me most. Even families with significant resources, the ones who could afford anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 in consultancy fees, were still overwhelmed. If they were confused, I kept thinking, what chance does everyone else have? So that's the lens that I'm presenting from today. Not a generic overview of the process, but a real inside view of how decisions actually get made, what admissions officers are actually looking for, and what I wish every family knew from the start. And that's why Early Bird exists. My amazing co-founder, Jessica, and I built Early Bird to make thoughtful college planning accessible to every family, not just the ones with insider access. So when I was reading files for UC Santa Cruz and UC Berkeley, we were expected to get through about 10 applications in an hour to keep pace. So do the math. That's 6 minutes per student, 4 years of a kid's life, 6 minutes. Before I even got to the essay, I already had a feeling about the student. GPA, course rigor, activities. I'd be scanning for a pattern, not reading line by line. And I'd be asking myself one question: who is this person? The files that stood out weren't always the most impressive on paper. They were the ones where everything pointed in the same direction. The activities, the essays, the additional comments, they all told the same story. The files that struggled were the ones where I finished reading and really still couldn't answer, what does this student actually care about? When two students have nearly identical academic profiles, the same GPA, same rigor, same activities, and I had to choose one, I'm going to look to the essay every time. It's the only place in the entire application where the student really speaks directly to the admission officer. And I can tell in the first paragraph whether a real human being wrote it or not. Most families spend their energy trying to make everything perfect, but the families who actually have an advantage are the ones who understand the game. And that game is building their student's story with intention from the very beginning. So now you know how fast decisions happen. And the question is, what are we actually looking for in those 6 minutes? It's not a perfect GPA. It's not a trophy shelf. It's something harder to manufacture and honestly more powerful when it's actually real. So it's worth explaining two different concepts: the spike and then what we call the X factor. So a spike is what gets you noticed by the admission office. Your X factor is actually what gets you admitted. And those are two very different things. And most families only focus on the spike. So think of the spike as the headline, while the X factor is the story underneath it. And really, you need both to stand out. And so when I think about an X factor, what I'm looking for are really a couple of different things. First, intellectual vitality. That's a buzzword that you'll hear in admissions a lot. And what that means is genuine curiosity, not just achievement. So is the student learning because they love it or because it looks good? And admission officers can absolutely tell the difference. The second piece of the X factor is social maturity. Will this student be a great roommate, a good classmate, someone who makes the people around them better? Colleges are building communities, not just classes. And then another piece of the puzzle of the X factor is institutional fit. So would this student actually thrive here? Do we want this student here? And does the application make the case that they belong on this campus specifically, not just any campus? Another thing that you're looking for in the X Factor is patterns, not necessarily awards. And so these aren't titles or trophies, they're patterns, and they show up or they don't across every single piece of the application. The essays, the recommendations, the activities list. All of this should be telling the same cohesive story really about a student's character. And the strongest applications they definitely don't feel manufactured. When you read them, you think, of course the student belongs here. Why would we not admit them? And so the question to be asking yourself right now is, if someone were to pick up your student's application and read it for 5 minutes, would they know exactly who your student is, what their character is, and why they belong on that campus? If the answer is anything less than yes, then that's exactly where the work is. So you're probably wondering, what happens once the file lands on a desk? And in order to really understand that, beyond the quick 6-minute decision, is really, let's talk about how colleges actually evaluate what they're reading, because not every school is looking for the same thing. So the answer really depends entirely on where your student is applying. And this is one of the most important things I can tell you today, and most families don't understand this. The admissions game at a liberal arts college looks fundamentally different from a state flagship, and both look completely different from how an Ivy League does admissions. Knowing which type of school you're dealing with changes everything about how you prepare, and it starts with understanding one key distinction: holistic versus numerical. So most colleges, and especially most selective colleges, are using holistic review. What that means is that's a commitment from that college in writing on their websites to evaluate your child as a whole person, not just a collection of numbers. So think about it in 2 categories: the bar and then the edge. So GPA and course rigor, or how competitive the set of classes that your student is taking, tend to set the bar for consideration. And I'm talking at highly selective institutions. Essays, activities, your student's character, their letters of recommendation are what would create the edge for that student. So you need both, but they serve different purposes. And then there's the numerical review, or admissions really based more by a formula. So not every school is holistic. This is the case. I'll use an example in California where I live. There's the CSU system, which it stands for California State University. There's 23 schools in that system. And the way that they do admission is based off of a direct formula, based on a combination of the student's GPA and the specific coursework that that student has completed. There's no essays, no activity lists, no letters of recommendation. The numbers either qualify you or they don't. And so knowing this matters because it really changes your strategy. For a formula-based school, every point of your GPA counts. For a highly selective school, every point of your GPA also counts. But keep in mind, for that holistic school, the story also does really matter just as much as the statistics. And so something I'd like to make you aware of today is an insider tool. It's called the Common Data Set. Most families have never heard of this, but it's one of the most powerful things that you can tap into as you start to navigate planning for college. So the Common Data Set is a set of questions and answers that every college publishes, and it shows you exactly what factors that school weighs in their admissions decisions. Pretty valuable. So let me give you a real example of what that looks like in practice. At the Ivy Leagues, when you pull up the Common Data Set across all of the Ivies in the Ivy League, you can see a common thread that GPA leads at 100% importance. They need to know that you are academically, if they admit you, going to thrive on their campus. But rigor, essays, recommendations, students' character, extracurriculars, class rank, and talent, those are important, but those all cluster at right about 88%. So what that tells you is that GPA is definitely one of the number one thing that they look at first, and then closely followed by that other set of qualities that I just mentioned. And so every single component at an Ivy League needs to be strong. The margins between admitted and rejected students are incredibly thin, and the factors that tip decisions are almost always the subjective ones. In other words, the student's X factor, the essays, the recommendation, and overall a student's character, how the story comes together as a whole. So that's very different from more of a mid-tier school where a strong GPA and a solid essay might be enough to stand out. The common data set tells you which game you're actually playing. And here's a quick plug. On the Early Bird platform, we've actually linked the common data set directly to every single college in our database. So instead of hunting it down yourself, it's right there alongside everything else you need to know about that school. And so that's the kind of insider access that we're trying to make available to every single family. So I know I've just spoken a lot about highly selective institutions and how they do their admissions, but here's really the reassuring truth. And here's what I want every parent on this webinar to hear. You don't have to be a perfect student. You just have to be a compelling one, because that's really what colleges are looking for, is that compelling story. And so a lower test score or a slight GPA dip can absolutely be compensated for by an incredible essay or a meaningful, sustained commitment to something that matters. Holistic review exists precisely because colleges know that numbers don't tell the entire story. The student who maybe struggled in their sophomore year but turned it around junior year and can speak honestly about that growth, that is a compelling story, and that's something that that student should absolutely own and communicate in an effective way on their application. So now that you understand how colleges evaluate applications, let's talk about when to start building one. And I promise it's actually earlier than you think, but it is less stressful than you'd expect. So I'd like to reframe something right from the start. 8th and 9th grade is not what we consider the pre-college phase. We consider this the discovery phase, and that distinction matters. When we start early, we're actually removing pressure, not adding it. The families who begin with intention in 8th and 9th grade are the ones who arrive at junior year calm, clear, and confident instead of frantic. The ticking clock that causes so much buzz and 11th grade anxiety, that's gone. Starting early is how you silence it. And so at 14, your child has something incredibly valuable: time and permission to explore without consequence. They can join the robotics club, quit the robotics club, try out for the school play, pick it back up, change their mind 3 more times. And none of it is a high stakes error. That is the gift of starting early and exploring and discovering early. Instead of frantically searching for a passion at 17, they get to discover one more naturally at 14. That's a completely different energy, and it shows in the application. You can absolutely tell. The families who navigate this best are not the ones who make college the center of every conversation either. They're the ones who help their kids tap into their own unique strengths, interests, and curiosity, and trust that the application will follow if you do that piece well. A stronger, more authentic person makes a stronger, more authentic application. That's not a coincidence. That's the entire strategy. So your practical nuts and bolts for 8th and 9th grade families. Use summers intentionally. Not every summer needs to be a curated program or a resume builder, but for these summers, I really want students to be exploring, trying something new, getting a job, traveling if you can. Summer is a low stakes runway to be able to discover and tap into really that authentic view of yourself. Build strong academic habits now. A student's GPA, the GPA clock starts at the beginning of their freshman year, 9th grade. The GPA really sets the foundation for everything that follows. It's much easier to protect a strong GPA than to recover a weak one. So building those strong academic habits now is essential. I want families to be thinking intentionally. There's a difference between being purposeful and being anxious. We want the first one. So show up, try things, pay attention to what lights your student up. Another great tip for a 8th or 9th grade family is to take a major quiz, which we have in our platform. And it's really a great tool at this age. not to lock anything in, but to spark conversation and self-awareness. Not many 14 or 15-year-olds necessarily know what they want to be when they grow up, nor should they know what they want to be when they grow up. But what they should be doing is thinking critically about who they are and being self-aware of their strengths. And something like a major quiz can help you kind of figure out your lane and your path. So you've done the discovery work, and now it's 10th grade. And this is where we start getting intentional about what stays and what goes. This is the year to start challenging yourself, especially academically. AP or advanced placement, honors, IB, which is dual enrollment, and outside coursework. Whatever your school offers, we want for your students to be pushing into it and stretching themselves to try and tackle more rigorous coursework. So here's the nuance. Colleges want to see you challenging yourself, not just succeeding in easy classes. A B in an AP class often reads better than an A in a standard one, especially in 10th grade. Rigor signals readiness. And if you can tackle a little bit of rigor in 10th grade, that means in 11th grade, which is a really critical academic year, your student will be even more ready to tackle more rigor. So if your school has limited options, community college courses, online coursework, local university programs, those are all fair game. Colleges really respect students who seek out challenge, even when the system doesn't hand it to them directly. I want to also take a minute to bust a myth that a lot of families are still operating under, and that's the idea that a long list of activities make a strong application. It absolutely doesn't. So the era of joining everything to check boxes is over. More selective universities are not looking for students who do everything. They're really looking for students who do 1 to 3 things with exceptional depth. So if your student is in 8 clubs and leading none of them, that's not a strength. That's just a noisy application that doesn't feel cohesive and doesn't really tell that story. So remember, your X factor is the clear self-directed thread that runs through everything. Your activities, your essays, your recommendations. Self-directed is the key phrase in that sentence. So it gives the reader a framework for understanding you as an applicant. 10th grade is the year to start identifying what that thread is. So what is your student gravitating towards naturally? Where are they spending their time when no one's watching? That's worth paying attention to and following. So that intentionality is super important. And this is really the year to start making choices. Start letting go of the activities that don't genuinely light your student up and doubling down on the ones that do. The goal is absolutely depth in 2 to 3 areas of real interest and to begin stepping naturally into leadership roles over time. Not manufactured leadership, but earned leadership, the kind that comes from when you actually care about something and you want to lead it because of that genuine care. So really, a student who has been deeply involved in one thing for 3 years and grown into a leadership role tells a far more compelling story than a student who's joined 6 things but led nothing and been more surface level than purposeful. And so here's the payoff, and here's how it all connects. Depth creates narrative, and narrative creates memorable applications, and memorable applications get admitted. So that's the entire game that we want you to be playing. And it starts right here in 10th grade with the choices your student makes about where they put their energy outside of the classroom. So now your student has direction and real momentum, and junior year is when everything starts to accelerate and when the story they've been building finally starts coming together on paper. However, it's worth pausing right now to chat a bit about the test optional landscape. So right around this time, usually late 10th grade, early 11th grade, one question starts dominating every parent conversation. What do we do about standardized testing? And so test optional is not test blind, and it's important to know the difference. So this is one of the most misunderstood shifts in college admissions right now. Test optional, which relates to the SAT and the ACT, the 2 standardized tests that colleges sometimes require, What that means is that a school will not penalize an applicant if they don't submit a score. But that doesn't mean that scores don't matter. And so test blind, that's another testing policy that a college could have. That means that scores are not considered at all. A small number of schools actually do this, but the vast majority of test optional schools will absolutely factor in strong scores when they see one. So assuming that test optional means testing doesn't matter is honestly one of the most common and costly mistakes that a family can make right now. So here's the strategic truth. And this is advice that I give to every family. If your student's score is at or above the school's middle 50% range, let me break that down. The SAT is out of 1,600. And let's say that a college has a published middle 50% range, which you can find all those numbers on the Early Bird platform, of 1,300 to 1,360. If your student's SAT score is, say, a 1,320, that puts you in the middle 50% range. I would want a student to submit that score. That strengthens the application. If it's below that range, say it's a 1,280, then do not submit it. It will not help. And at selective schools, it can actually quietly hurt the application. And so that middle 50% range is public information. It comes from the common data set that I mentioned earlier on the webinar. And you want to look it up and really understand where your scores line up with your particular set of colleges that you're applying to. Strong scores absolutely still matter at highly selective schools. So highly selective schools are using scores that is a meaningful differentiator. And sometimes highly selective schools are actually requiring standardized test scores. So it's worth pausing to just explain that there's test blind, test optional, and test required. So if it's required and you want to apply, you have to submit your scores, whether or not you're in that middle 50%. Most schools land in that test optional realm, which is why we're spending time focusing our efforts there, but it's important to understand the full landscape. So a pattern that I saw repeatedly in admissions is that when everything else is equal between two similar applicants, a strong score can be the quiet tiebreaker that tips the decision. And conversely, a weak score submitted voluntarily signals a misjudgment. It doesn't just lower the academic profile, but it raises a question about whether the student is self-aware and really connecting with what that school wants and what that school is looking for. And neither of those look good. So in terms of what a family should actually do, we want you to treat testing like an option worth pursuing, not an obligation worth stressing over. So my advice is prepare, take it seriously, and then make a strategic decision school by school based on the numbers. Most students benefit from taking the SAT or ACT 2 to 3 times. They're offered throughout the entire year and into the summer, and really building in prep times starting in the fall of junior year, so you're not cramming. The benchmark that I look for is that a student is at least in Algebra 2 or has completed Algebra 2. So if you're in the second half of Algebra 2 or higher in your math class, that's a really good time to start seriously thinking about test prep and studying for the SAT or the ACT. And of course, remember, consistent practice over several months beats an intensive week before the exam every single time. So I tell my students, treat it like training for a sport, not pulling an all-nighter. The bottom line here is that test optional is a great admission practice. I'm happy that it exists because it does give families more flexibility, but it did not make testing irrelevant. The students who use that flexibility strategically, submitting when it helps and withholding your scores back when it doesn't, are the ones who really benefit the most from this policy. So junior year is the most important year in regards to test scores and then academically on the transcript. Like without question, junior year is that most important year. Colleges will see a student's grades from junior year before they will see official senior year grades if you're applying in the early rounds, which happen between October and December of the senior year. And so because a student doesn't have official grades during that early window when they're applying, your GPA at the end of your junior year is really the GPA that will be evaluated. And so that's why there's such an important emphasis on the junior year. So what I tell my students is really junior year is a year to stretch. Take the most rigorous course load you can genuinely handle. And that looks and feels different for every single student. If you've never taken an AP or an honors class, I don't want you signing up for 5, because that's most likely a recipe for tanking your GPA and hurting your application. But if you've taken maybe 2 to 3 AP or honors classes between 9th and 10th grade, junior year would be a great time to try and increase that rigor just a bit, maybe take 4 or 5. It's important that students really pay attention to this and pay attention to what they can genuinely handle. Not the ones that, not taking the courses that look the most impressive on paper and will tank your GPA, but really what you as a student can handle. And that can be a hard thing to deliberate on. And so that's where the advice of a seasoned counselor can be really, really helpful, and understanding what your school offers and what the right balance of classes is for your particular school. So one other thing to note in terms of academics for junior year that's important is if you're a student that goes to a school that offers AP classes, strong AP scores are really a bonus signal for your application. They tell colleges that you can handle college level coursework. AP classes are taken, and then you take an AP exam in May at the end of the class, and those exams are scored on a 1 through 5. And so if your student is able to score a 4 or a 5, that's really meaningful context and can validate your readiness for colleges. 3s are great too, and that's kind of a game time strategic decision whether or not to include a 3 on your application. 4s and 5s, I generally always have students include. 11th grade is also really about kind of figuring out what your brand is so that you can tell your own unique story. And so by 11th grade, your student really should be able to answer that one question clearly. Who am I? What makes me unique? And what do I care about? And if they can't, then your application will feel really scattered. So think of it like a brand. Every piece of the application, your activities, your essays, your recommendations, should really reinforce that same central narrative. And so this is not about being something you're not. It's about getting crystal clear on who you already are and making sure that that comes through across the application. So a quick note on letters of recommendation, because that also comes up in junior year. Students typically need 2 letters from teachers in core classes. Those core classes are math, science, English, history, world language. I generally like my students to pick teachers from sophomore and junior year. You as a freshman student in your history class is a different student than you as a junior student in your history class. And so it makes the letter of recommendation more relevant if it comes from a more recent teacher. A great rec letter isn't from the most impressive teacher or necessarily the class where you got an A or an A+. It's from the teacher who really knows your student most deeply and can comment on their character and their classroom contributions. So admission officers are reading really for 3 things as a reminder. They're looking for that intellectual curiosity in the classroom, a student's character both in the classroom and outside of it, and evidence that the student will contribute to a campus community. And letters of rec can help validate a lot of those things that admission officers are looking for. So junior year is really a time to start cultivating authentic relationships with those who are writing your letters of recommendation. So I always encourage my students, go to your teacher's office hours, spend time getting to know them, make sure they know who you are. Teachers really only are only able to write what they've witnessed. You can't assume that they will go to bat for you and write beyond that. So it's important that you show up and you really cultivate those relationships. So junior year is also the year to get your activities list organized. Every leadership role, job, volunteer hour, independent projects, those all need to be documented, and you'll need it for every application. Most notably, students apply through what's called the Common Application, which houses about 1,100 different colleges, and you will have to complete what's called an activities list. You're given space to elaborate on up to 10 different activities, and so it is important to be thinking about what you're going to be putting on your activities list. And it's definitely easier to start to document sooner than later. And so your activities list and your resume, you want to think of those as like living documents, starting now and updating it every semester. And then by the time that applications open in senior year, you'll have everything at your fingertips. My students, quite honestly, start thinking about their activities list in spring of junior year and are starting to document it and actually craft the words that go onto the page for the actual application right about now. So one thing I want to mention with regards to activities, I get asked this a lot, like, well, what are the best activities? I cannot stress enough, a summer job is one of the most underrated things on a college application. It signals maturity, responsibility, real world experience. And admissions officers absolutely notice that, especially at selective schools where every other applicant might have a fancy internship or a curated summer program. Don't get me wrong, those are also valuable and can help students achieve that depth, but also don't miscount how valuable a job can actually be. One other thing that families should understand is that the Common App, when you go to talk about your activities, you're only given 150 characters to describe each activity. That's literally a tweet. So it's important to be intentional and start thinking about how to distill what you do into the most compelling, specific language possible. Because remember, this is all part of that story and that cohesive brand you're trying to build. And so the worst time to figure out what your student cares about is October of senior year. Junior year is when the brainstorming should begin, and before that pressure is on, especially as it relates to mapping out your essays that will be required for your applications. Just to give you some reference, students often have like 40 plus pages of written word that they have on their various essay documents by the time they're done mapping out all the essays for the colleges that they're applying to. So the essays play a huge piece and are very, very time consuming. And so starting sooner than later is really important. So what I would do is, set aside an hour with no agenda and really talk to your student about who they are, help them figure out how to brainstorm. On our platform, we have a great list of brainstorming questions for you to begin the process. And from there, you can dig for what I call gold. Dig for those golden nuggets that can start to tease out what are those authentic stories about you that are going to make for a really compelling essay. And so one other thing I'll mention on essays that is just a worthwhile insight is that sometimes when you go to apply to your colleges, they will have optional essays. So they'll have maybe 3 or 4 essay questions, and the last one may be optional. You want to do the optional essay. In college admissions, optional always means do it, because it's another chance for you to share another angle about who you are as a person. So 12th grade and really spring of junior year into early 12th grade before you actually submit your applications is really about crafting your college list. And so I want families to really stop asking which college is best and instead start asking, where will my student do best? And those are 2 very, very different questions, and only one of them actually matters. So rankings tell you honestly where other people want to go. They measure reputation, research output, and endowment, but they don't necessarily measure whether your particular student will thrive, feel supported, and ultimately graduate and go get that job that we're all hoping for our students. So the family that chases prestige and lands at the wrong fit, unfortunately, often ends up with debt, struggle, and a transfer. But the family that finds the right fit often ends up with a student who really flourishes somewhere that no one maybe has heard of, or flourishes at that exact right fit beyond prestige. And so here's something that I heard an admission officer say once, and this has really stuck with me as a counselor. The holy trinity of a good college list is three things. Your student will be happy there, the college will actually admit them, and you as a family can afford it. So we want for you to build your college list from that foundation, not from a magazine ranking or from what your neighbor's kid is doing, and definitely not from a school logo on a sweatshirt. So building a balanced college list boils down to coming up with a list of 10 to 12 schools. I believe that if a student spends the time researching up front, they know who they are, they know what they're looking for, you really don't need to apply to more than 10 to 12 schools. And of that 10 to 12 schools, every list needs 3 tiers. There's reach schools. Absolutely. If you do want to apply to a more prestigious school or the name brand university, like, you've worked hard, you should do that, but it needs to not dominate your list. Reach schools cannot dominate your list, or unfortunately, you're not going to end up with a lot of options. And optionality is what we really want for students so that they feel empowered and have control through this process. And so the list needs to be balanced with a couple of reach schools, mostly target schools, and then a few likely schools. I always tell my students that I want you to love your likely, and you should have at least 2 likely schools. So schools where we feel really confident when we're looking at the admission rate that you're going to get in, but also that if all else failed, you'd be thrilled to go to one of those institutions. And so a well-balanced list really gives you that optionality and leverage and the ability to compare financial aid packages, which is where, for a lot of families, the real decision often happens. So students and families need to really pay attention to what's called sticker price versus net price. And there's a key distinction here. So most families make the mistake of falling in love with a school and then discovering in April of senior year that they can't afford it. And that's really a heartbreaking and very avoidable situation. So what we want families to do is to shift the conversation from sticker price of a college to the net price. And net price is what the college will actually cost you and your family based off of your financial aid criteria, your own income and assets. And so every college has what's called a net price calculator on their website. It's also linked on every college in the Early Bird platform, so you can easily access that. It takes 5 minutes to complete the calculator, and it is an invaluable tool for you to have a better understanding of the predicted cost of what that college will actually cost you. A $70,000 sticker price school that offers your student a $40,000 merit award is cheaper than a $45,000 state school with no aid. And so the math is never what it really actually looks like on the surface. And so definitely spend that time being familiar with the net price and figuring out really what makes most sense. Treating financial fit with the same weight as academic fit, location, and campus culture really will save you and your family a lot in the long run. And so really, the bottom line is that the best college for your student is the one where they're going to show up, they're going to feel seen, they're going to do the work, and then they'll actually graduate. And so that school exists. It may not be one that you're aware of, but with the right research and digging and really thinking critically about all of the different data points available to you, you're going to be able to find that right school. And so with regards to data, we really want families to stop guessing and start navigating. And so we've talked a lot about how to find the right schools. Now we really want to talk about kind of how you evaluate them, because once you have a list, you need to know how to read between the lines. And there are really 3 numbers that tell you most of what you need to know. And those three numbers are admit rates, yield rates, and retention rates. 3 numbers, 3 completely different stories, and most families only pay attention, honestly, to the admit rate. That's the one that makes the headline on the New York Times, Stanford University, 3.5% admit rate. Okay, well, that's a piece of the puzzle, but let's also take a look at their yield rate and their retention rate and look beyond kind of what gets most of the buzz in this college admissions mania. So the admit rate obviously tells you how hard it is to get in, and how selective the school is. It's the number everyone obsesses over, and honestly is the least useful of the three for predicting whether or not your student will actually be happy there. A 5% admit rate tells you a school is hard to get into, but it really doesn't tell you about what happens after you arrive. Like, college admissions is about not just getting in, but what happens after you get in and you actually start the clock and start your college journey. And so unfortunately, low admit rates have really become a flawed proxy for quality. So don't let a number that reflects competition convince you it reflects the right fit for your student. Yield rates. So that's how much students actually want to be on that campus. So the yield rate is the percentage of admitted students who actually choose to enroll. A percent that when a college says yes to them, those students say yes back to that college and end up actually attending that particular institution. And that's a high yield rate really means that students who get in actually choose that school over their other options. And that's a genuine signal of desirability, not just perceived prestige. It's also why demonstrated interest matters so much at certain schools. That's a buzzword that you'll hear. But that's basically a certain set of colleges care about a student reaching out to them and genuinely building a relationship with them along their college planning journey. You can figure out demonstrated interest and whether or not that matters through the Early Bird platform as well as the common data set. And so retention rate, that's the third metric that I think is super important and arguably the most. It's what we call the happiness factor. And so the retention rate tells you what percentage of freshmen come back for sophomore year. And so on our platform, what we have is only colleges with 80% or higher retention rates. And so a school with 80% or higher retention rate is telling you something very powerful. 8 out of 10 students feel supported, engaged, and want to stay and choose to come back from freshman year to sophomore year. And that's really a powerful signal to be looking for. So compare that to a school with a 60% retention rate. That means 4 in 10 students are leaving after the first year. And that's not just a statistic. In my opinion, that's a warning that there's probably a better institution out there that can really give your student that full support to do well once they're there. So the intel is hiding in plain sight around kind of those 3 rates, and students who use it have a meaningful advantage over ones who don't. So in short, we want for you to start optimizing for the retention rate, the financial fit, and the demonstrated interest strategy, if that exists for the set of schools that you're applying to. And that's really where the real leverage is for applicants. So the data is all there. You just have to know where to look, and now you do. So everything we've talked about today, including the X factor, finding your fit, financial strategy, the 6-minute admission decision, test optional landscape, this is all insider knowledge that honestly used to live exclusively behind an expensive college consultant paywall, but we built Early Bird to change that. The platform does use AI and in the right way, not to replace your student's story, but to help your family find your strategy early and execute on it with clarity and confidence. We don't just match students to schools they can get into. We match them to schools where they'll actually finish, and filtering for those institutions with the 80% retention rate where students really do feel supported enough to stay. So this isn't just a college planning tool. It's really a $1.4 trillion student debt crisis prevention tool, which is that debt crisis exists from poor planning and poor fit, and we're trying to avoid that. And it's really the root cause of most college dropouts. And so we solve for that from the very beginning. I'm not sure how many people on this webinar know this, but there's a 385-to-1 student to counselor ratio in the US. I've sat in that seat as a high school counselor, and it's a very hard job. And so that means your student's counselor has 384 other kids on their plate. The guidance your family really needs simply isn't available, unfortunately, in most schools. And even with lower caseloads, that's really, it's not a lot of time that you get with that strategic guidance and college counselor. And so really what Early Bird is designed to do is give every family the kind of structured, personalized, expert-backed support that used to require a very large check. And so that's all I have for you today. We're going to end with some Q&A, and I really would love to know what questions you have. What did we cover that you want to go deeper on, and what keeps you up at night about this process? So let's talk. Any questions in the chat? If you have any questions, you're welcome to put those in the chat. Give it a minute. Yes, so the question is, can you talk more about demonstrated interest? Such a great question. Thank you for asking that. So there's a group of colleges that care about what is called demonstrated interest, which basically means that an applicant takes the time to reach out to the college via email and introduce themselves, ask thoughtful questions. The student might also be attending a virtual information session. Maybe they're actually visiting the college specifically on their campus. But it's a way for when an admission officer is evaluating an applicant, all things are the same on paper, and they're having a really hard time figuring out, of the two applicants, which one am I going to admit? The admission officer is going to admit the student that has taken the time to reach out to their admission officer. And so the colleges that engage in demonstrated interest, they actually have admission officers who are assigned regionally, and they're the people that are visiting your child's high school. They're also the people that will be reading your admission file. And so it's important, you can look this up online very easily, who your actual admission officer is, and then to start to build a little bit of a relationship there. And without being salesy, like it's about being genuinely curious, and then having that person with boots on the ground at the university guide you to the right answer. And so there's, the right and wrong ways to definitely handle demonstrated interest, but it comes in the form of communication via email, signing up for virtual tours, clicking on your emails and actually clicking on the links. Maybe if a college offers an interview as part of their admission process, it's actually signing up for the interview. That's a way to show demonstrated interest. Some colleges even go as far as saying by applying early, that's a way to show demonstrated interest. So it's a tool that colleges use as they're trying to deliberate between 1 to 2 applicants. Generally speaking, more selective universities like Ivy League and colleges with sub 10% admit rates, they're not paying attention to demonstrated interest. But colleges that fall to that next tier, they absolutely are. Also, a general rule of thumb is large public institutions like UCLA, UC Berkeley, UT Austin, they don't have the bandwidth to pay attention to demonstrated interest. So it's everybody that falls in between that generally does. And you can do a deep dive and try and figure out whether or not a college actually does care about that through the common data set and through the Early Bird platform. Any other questions? All right. So what's next for us? Before we sign off, we have 3 quick asks. Follow us on social media so you don't miss what we're putting out next, including the next 4 webinars in our series. Fill out our short survey, which is in the chat and which I will also be emailing. But please fill it out right now. It literally takes 1 minute. And by filling out that survey, you're going to gain premium access to the Early Bird platform. And so keep an eye on your inbox for the recording as well as that survey, and then feel free to share it with anyone who needs it. Thank you so much for being here, and that's a wrap.